Okay, then. I think we're recording. I think this microphone is working. Hello and welcome to episode 184 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I'm wearing my Mulon Labe shirt today in honor of the Spartan 300, led by King Leonidas, who died at the Battle of Thermopylae. They died in glory. I watched a documentary about it last night. And this is my beverage, which I haven't put the paper umbrella into yet. So we open said beverage, insert little paper umbrella, immediately take it back out again, because its purpose is mainly ostentation and to show my sophistication and class to the viewer. Take a sip of said beverage. And then I guess it's my duty to point out that, of course, 184 is not a prime number. It is 2 times 2 times 2 times 23. Ugh. And I was even considering just skipping this weekend because there's not a whole heck of a lot of questions asked. But then, last night I was thinking, well, maybe I can just skip this weekend. And then this morning, more people asked questions. So we're above 20 now, which is okay. And so the show must go on, and I'm going to commence to answering questions here after making a few slight adjustments. Okay, then. So I guess I've finished the almost obligatory, completely digressive preamble. And so the next thing to do is to just wade into these questions here. And the first question is from Scudamane. And Scudamane says, do you ever say, I'm sorry, or feel sorry for things you may have unintentionally done to make someone upset? I guess, according to some at home, I don't do this, and truthfully, I don't often feel very sorry. I also don't like to say I'm sorry if I'm not actually sorry. Of course, I don't like seeing anyone upset, and if it's something I've done that I can avoid, I will say that I will try not to do it again. I really don't like the idea of, quote, if you feel sorry for this, I will feel better, unquote. Or, quote, if you feel bad, then I'll feel good, unquote. Maybe I'm just overcomplicating being sorry, but it's always seemed complex to me, and I can relate to this. But I guess before I answer the question, I should look up the word sorry in the dictionary. Because sometimes you have people just trying to have a discussion or a debate or whatever it is, and they're completely at cross purposes. They can't possibly see eye to eye because they do not agree on the definition of the terms. Like something like a soul or free will, that kind of thing. Does it exist? Does it not exist? It depends on the definition. Capital G, God would be another one. So let's just look up sorry here. Sorry. Adjective. It's predicative. Feeling distress, especially through sympathy with someone else's misfortune. Okay, so that would be practically the same as compassion, wouldn't it? Except it would be more negative, I guess, because there's distress involved. Compassion doesn't necessarily involve distress. So sorry for means filled with compassion for. Yeah, I feel sorry for that person because, they're dealing with so much hardship, that kind of thing. So let's see. Number two, second definition, feeling regret or penitence. So feeling regret, yeah, that's from the Buddhist point of view, feeling regret is always bad karma. You shouldn't do it. And I have taken that to heart. I rarely feel regret. Although it's kind of strange that in the past, after I was pretty much cured of regret, still I would feel it mainly thinking about stuff that I did before I was cured of regret. It was like that memory just has like these sort of somewhat painful, like emotional tones just to the memory itself, so that I would still have flashbacks of feeling regret when remembering something that happened before I was cured of regret. So let's see here. Attributive, in a poor or pitiful state of or condition. Oh yeah, like we're gonna get rid of his sorry ass. That kind of thing. So we can just completely forget that one. So it can mean feeling distress, especially through sympathy with somebody else's misfortune, or it can mean feeling regret or penitence. And so I guess we should look up penitence. So penitence, the action or feeling of showing sorrow. Yeah, circular definitions. This is like an Oxford dictionary too. Showing sorrow and regret for having done something wrong. Repentance. So sorry is related to the word sorrow. So it'd be like sorrowful over having done such and such. But let's get back to the question now, shall we? Now that we've studied up on the key terms, especially sorry, do I ever say I'm sorry or feel sorry for things that you may have unintentionally done to make someone upset? I do say I'm sorry sometimes, especially at home with my beloved mate. But it's not like regret. It's not sorry in the terms in the sense of feeling remorseful. It's more like, well, I am like unhappy because you're unhappy because there's sort of like a group mind going on. You know, we're having an interaction. I might be catching hell for something. So it's a kind of, you know, let's see, how do I even explain this? It's not so much remorse, but still it's like um to say I'm sorry is more like a kind of way of saying, you know, I beg your pardon, you know, please forgive me. I didn't mean to do it. You know, I didn't necessarily think I was doing anything wrong by doing it. That kind of thing. But yeah, feeling actual remorse, wishing that you hadn't done something with an N, not an M. Um, yeah, I mean, you're just setting yourself up against reality. I mean, it's like wishing you hadn't done something in the past, which is irrevocable or irrevocable. I mean, you just can't change the past. So wishing that the past was different, I mean, it's just unnecessary self-inflicted suffering. So if I do say I'm sorry, the main meaning is like, I apologize. You know, I mean, they're practically synonymous. You know, it's like, I beg your pardon, that kind of thing. So let's see here. Did I answer the question? I also don't like to say I'm sorry if I'm not actually sorry. Yeah, I mean, that would be dishonest, wouldn't it? I mean, you'd essentially be lying. It might be considered to be a white lie and therefore okay by like Western secular standards. But still, I mean, you should be committed to truth. If you can't even manage conventional truth, how are you going to get to ultimate truth? Know what I'm saying? So let's see here. Of course, I don't like seeing anyone upset. Yeah, I don't like to see anyone upset either. I mean, even if somebody that I don't particularly like, I mean, for them to be upset, I mean, it'd be better if they kind of were, you know, sort of a little more humble, maybe. I mean, I don't like to see people that are just like gloating and completely, you know, just, you know, somebody that has like the opposite political view that I have, that they're just like smug and gloating. You know, I don't like to see that either. Let's see here now. I see my sweetie's just right outside the window. See, I'm not in the regular studio. I'm in the back bedroom, and so I've got a window directly in front of me. And if anyone goes out onto the back patio, I see it, and it can be distracting. So let's see here. See, I will say that I will try not to do it again. Yeah, that's fine. That's the best thing to do. I mean, if you really aren't repentant, I mean, it depends on your definition of sorry, I suppose. Or if you're just using I'm sorry, you know, the statement I'm sorry just as like a synonym for I apologize or I beg your pardon or please forgive me. that kind of thing, then I guess you can get away with it. But yeah, I do really relate to this statement. And remorse, regret is always bad karma. Even if someone is insisting that you feel regret. And of course, if an enemy is wanting you to feel sorry, that's just part of their revenge. They're not going to really forgive you. Or at least in many cases, like political enemies, they try to force somebody or compel somebody to say they're sorry just as like a weapon. It's almost like you're worse off if you apologize. It's sort of like it reminds me of the Call of the Wild, where it's talking about like sled dogs in Alaska in the Yukon Territory, where if there's a dog fight and one of the dogs goes down, all the other dogs that were just sitting there watching will just gang up on that dog that went down. But I already answered the question. There's no need for me to discuss the behavior of sled dogs. So I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Newman. And Newman says, has there ever been a Theravadin version of Tantric practice? For example, the Thai tiger skin wizard guys. Well, it's almost like a trick question. In Burma, you've got like, they're like, what's the word? Trying to think of the word, alchemists. So you've got like alchemists and wizards and so forth that are ordained monks, ordained Theravada Buddhist monks. But their practices that are along more or less tantric lines certainly are not in accord with Theravada Buddhism. So to the extent that they are tantric, to that same extent, they're not really in accordance with Theravada Buddhism. And if they're engaging in tantric sex practices, then they're not even monks. Once there's the amount of insertion amounting to the width of a sesame seed, then one is parajika, one is excommunicated from the Sangha for life, and one is no longer a monk. Certain other acts like stealing, I don't know if there's any kind of tantric spiritual practice that involves stealing, but just doing things that are at variance with orthodox, like rules of monastic discipline, fortune telling, that sort of thing. It's not really in accordance with Theravada, so it's not really a Theravadan practice. It's just a practice that some Theravada Buddhist monks, just officially ordained Theravada Buddhist monks, will do, like reading palms, astrology, alchemy, trying to do, there's even like a certain amount of necromancy going on in Burma where certain monks, including at least one famous one that I know of, allegedly would put out raw meat and raw blood that these hungry ghosts would feed on until the hungry ghosts are like jonesing for their raw meat and raw blood and reliant on this wizard necromancer monk who can then say, all right, you want more of that raw blood? Well, you're going to have to do what I say. You're going to have to do my bidding. And then they become like the servants or slaves of the necromancer. There's supposedly, allegedly, is some of that going on in Burma. But tantric, if you're talking about capital T Tantra, not just sort of unethical conduct that is done mindfully as a way of sort of transcending the ethics of it, and trying to use the behavior of the Kali Yuga as a kind of spiritual vehicle, which is what capital T Tantra is doing. But I don't think you couldn't really do that within a Theravada Buddhist context. To the extent that you're doing that, you're not Theravadan. So you can have monks that are technically ordained Theravada Buddhist monks who are doing tantric practices that aren't sufficient to get them excommunicated, like no sex, for example. Eating meat's fine, Eating fish is fine. Even drinking alcohol, it's against the rules, but at least it's not going to get you kicked out of the Sangha. But to the extent you're doing that kind of stuff, you're at odds with Theravada Buddhist ethics. So, yeah, there have been Theravada Buddhist tantric practices, especially now. All of a sudden, I'm remembering the Maha'ari, and the Maha'ari were like a tantric sect of Buddhism, similar to Tibetan Buddhism, that was the prevailing school of Buddhism among the Burmese before they converted to Theravada Buddhism in the 11th century. So, like the early Pagan Empire, before King Anawrahta forcibly converted his country to Theravada Buddhism, you had like tantric monks that were practicing a kind of Vajrayana kind of stuff. And I would assume when Burma was essentially by the royal decree converted to Theravada, you had a lot of these tantric monks who sort of superficially converted to Theravada so they could stay in their monasteries, at their temples and all that nevertheless were still doing tantric stuff, getting drunk, for example. But again, it has happened historically with nominally Theravada Buddhist monks, but to the extent that they really are doing tantric practices, to that same extent, they're not following Theravada Buddhism. So you can interpret that as you please. But there are like wizards and alchemists and necromancers and that sort of thing in Theravada Buddhist countries that some of them are ordained monks. And officially, technically, they're Theravada Buddhists because they're ordained Theravada Buddhist monks who haven't yet succeeded in getting themselves excommunicated. But still, they're like not conscientious monks. Even monks who do horoscopes and read palms, that kind of thing, they're deviating from what the texts say they should be doing. Because the texts say you're not supposed to be doing fortune telling and palmistry and, interpreting omens and that kind of stuff, much less doing like the hard capital T Tantra stuff, the 5 M's, for example. And the 5 M's of capital T Tantra are Maituna, which is sex. Can't do that in Theravada if you're an ordained monk. Matcha, which is fish. Mamsa, which is meat, eating fish. Maja, which is literally intoxicant, but here it means like alcohol. And then there's one that they don't really know what it means anymore. I think probably originally it was a kind of drug, but now because they don't know exactly what it is, they replace it with parched grain, which I don't know why parched grain would be some transgressive 5th M for a tantric practitioner. But I'm just going to move on to the next question here. Newman's second question is, have you ever encountered devas? And not really that I know of. You can feel a presence, that kind of thing. The presence might just be like a higher level of your own consciousness that you're not aware of at the ordinary worldly level at all times. So, for example, I've been near death a few times. Like before I was a monk, you're driving too fast in cold weather, you hit a patch of black ice, the cars start sliding out of control, and it's like everything just becomes crystal clear. You stop thinking. It is as though time slows down, but really it's just you're operating at a faster level. But it's like without thinking. It's just like something takes over your body and just does whatever is necessary to keep you alive until the danger is past, and then you return to a more or less normal state and start thinking in thoughts again. And that happened to me once when I was in Burma. I was living under a rock ledge in this little box canyon. The cave or overhanging rock ledge was right at the end of the canyon. And sometimes I'd be looking up at the walls of the canyon thinking, I wonder what's up there. I wonder what it's like up there, because I really hadn't been walking around up above very much. But then I'd think, it's just too steep. I mean, it's almost like vertical walls to this canyon. And so I just thought, it's just too difficult for me to climb up there. And then one night after dark, there was a brush fire, and it's like burning leaves and grass are falling off the top of the canyon and landing on the certain sides of the canyon that weren't completely vertical, but still like steep. And it was causing the fire to gradually get down into my little canyon. And so this same canyon wall that I figured was too steep to climb in broad daylight, I'm climbing it in the middle of the night with no flashlight. I've got a lit candle in one hand and a bamboo pole in the other hand, in like a sarong, a monk's robes, and sandals, flip-flops. I'm climbing up this thing, and the light of the fire actually kind of lit the way when I was going up. But going back down again after the fire is out and it's dark, I've got a lit candle in one hand. But when you're going downhill, when it's really steep, the ground is way down there. It's not like right in front of your face, like when you're going uphill. And so I'm trying to go downhill, like slowly work my way down this hill. And of course, I stepped on some dry leaves or dry grass or whatever. My feet just shot out from under me, and I start tobogganing on my back down the side of this very steep slope, way more than 45 degrees. And again, it was that same sort of mental state where it's like you stop thinking and just immediately, without thinking at all, you're just like in this state of heightened awareness where you're just doing whatever it is that's going to keep you alive. And it's like grabbing it at vines that would just snap. And for some reason, I kept a grip. I immediately let go of the bamboo pole. But that candle, I mean, without having time to think about it, I kept a firm grip on that candle, because if I dropped and lost that candle, I would be stuck there until morning on the side of that hill, assuming that I didn't just fall off. And so eventually, my foot just hit a clump of bamboo that was growing out of the side of the hill and stopped me, with my other foot hanging off this vertical drop off, which was only maybe 6 feet, but still it would have sped me up when on the downhill, on the ascent or the descent to the very bottom. But again, it could just, that's not necessarily a deva. That could just be like some higher aspect of your own consciousness that your thinking ego just is oblivious to most of the time. And it doesn't really step in until there's a real need for it. But I remember one time I was at Pandita Rama in Rangoon doing 2 months of intensive practice, meditation practice, under the tutelage of Mahasi U Pandita. And I was just kind of in this state of borderline despair for a while, which, if you've done intensive meditation retreats, you probably know that despair or desperation can arise under situations like this. Like your ego is just like battling against the practice, this kind of thing. And so I just like, if there's anybody out there, please show me a sign. And so I thought, all right, within the next 3 days, somebody has to come up to me and say the word sign, and that will be my sign. And then 2 days later, a friend of mine, a Burmese monk friend of mine, and a lay supporter, came to me, and they were getting me a Burmese ID card. And so they asked me to sign, but I mean, it wasn't in English. And so it was, this kind of thing. So, I mean, that didn't really count. But then I said, well, does this mean, or then somebody, I think it was the monk or the late, one of these two guys said, now that you have this Burmese ID card, you won't have to keep getting visas. And then the other one says, Masai Mbu, which Masai Mbu means it doesn't have anything to do with that. But still, somebody in my presence said sign. And I mean, I wasn't getting a lot of visitors. That was almost the only visit I received at the time. So, I mean, you could say that was some deva giving a sign, or you could say it was just coincidence, or you could just say that it's my own karma, my own mental states orchestrated the whole thing at a subconscious level. But the thing is, I mean, devas as a general rule, I mean, going with even like Buddhist cosmology, as a general rule, they're invisible. They could be standing right there next to you and you wouldn't see them. You might feel a presence, but you're not going to see them. Sort of like an ant crawls across your foot. It has no idea it's in immediate contact with a higher being. It doesn't see you. You're the great moving land where nothing grows or whatever. And I mean, assuming that an ant would even think. So yeah, encountering devas, I've never met one personally. Not that I'm aware of at the ordinary ego samsaric worldly level. Which is a very long answer to a very short question. But I have lived in places that were considered to be haunted by like terrestrial devas. I've lived in a few places like that. Like that overhanging rock ledge that I was talking about. It was considered to be guarded by an Osa Sound, which is a relatively powerful terrestrial deity in Burma. And a lot of people were just afraid to come near it because they were afraid of the Osa Sound. But I lived there for a combined total of about 3 years. Never saw the Osa Sound. Well, who knows? And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And I must say here that Newman has asked a transgressive fourth question. His name is going on a list. And if that's not sufficient to reform his misconduct, then he's going on another list. And he's just going to continue being added onto lists until he stops this. But in his, I guess I have to admit that he just forgot that he asked one question several days ago. And then he just decided he's going to ask his regulation 3 questions while completely forgetting that he had asked another question several days before. And we don't have a whole lot of questions, so maybe I'll give a desultory kind of answer to his transgressive fourth question, but the name is still going on the list. So Newman says, in Theravada cosmology, do you also find sublunary terrestrial daemons or devas inhabiting or embodying springs, rivers, streams, beautiful sacred places, etc.? And yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, in Orthodox Theravada, you've got Ruka devas who are like terrestrial small g gods inhabiting large trees. You've got Bhumi devas who are living on the ground. In fact, the Osa Sant that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago would be one of these terrestrial devas. I've lived in a number of those places. A lot of places in Burma where you're not supposed to spit on the ground. You're not supposed to take a pee on this hill, this kind of thing, because it will offend the Asant or the terrestrial deva or whatever it is. They firmly believe in what are called balu, which in Pali would be yaka, which is usually translated as ogre, or it's often translated as ogre. They're kind of monstrous being, but technically they are a small g god. They belong to the realm of the 4 kings, which is one level above the human level. So, I mean, they wouldn't count as daemons. I mean, they're still devas. So, there's like a small g god, superhuman being. I mean, really, Buddhism doesn't really have a category of like a daemon, which is below a god but above a human, that kind of thing. It's just if you're above human level, then you're at least a deva, a small g god. Above the devas are brahmas that are higher. They're like in a different realm than us. They're in the rupa loka. See, like devas and humans and animals and ghosts and denizens of hell and the asuras, we all are inhabitants of the kamaloka, or the sensuous world. And then above that is the rupa loka, which is the realm or the world inhabited by brahmas who have a physical body. It's a refined matter. I mean, they'd be invisible to us unless they really wanted us to see them. But still, they do have a body. And then above that is the arupa loka, which is formless beings. That's like the most refined realms in Buddhist cosmology, are the formless realms where the beings there are pure mind and have no physical body, not even of subtle matter, no physical body at all. So, yeah, and in Thailand and in Burma, you'll see like big trees that have like a little shrine either built onto the tree or right next to the tree, and people will come and make offerings. In fact, before the Burmese were Buddhists, before they converted to Buddhism, like when they're still living in the foothills of the Himalayas to the north of Burma, they followed what is called the Nat cult, which still is vestigial in Burmese culture, where they were essentially worshiping the spirits of humans that died violent deaths. And if you die a violent death or an unnatural death, according to the Burmese, that causes you to be an asane, which means like a green ghost, which is more powerful than if you just die of old age, die of natural causes, just kind of fade out. If your life force is just cut off suddenly, then you've got more of a kind of earthly momentum going, which causes you to be a more powerful spirit in the event that you are like still in the form of some kind of ghost or like a small g god that is still associated with this earth. And there's still some belief in that in Burma, the Nat cult, which is more of these more or less terrestrial deities. I'm not exactly sure where the gnats are supposed to live, though. But I mean, it's right there in the Pali text that there are like terrestrial small g gods that, for the most part, are invisible. But I mean, sometimes, like in even ancient Greek mythology, sometimes you can have someone who appears to be a human being, but really it's a god in disguise. Like in ancient Greece, there was some saying, I don't remember the exact words of it, which would be in ancient Greek anyway, but it's like you should be generous to beggars because it may be a god in disguise that's testing you. And that does happen in Pali texts also. So, yeah, it's just a belief in nature deities guarding certain areas or inhabiting certain areas is very common in Southeast Asia. And I'm just going to move on to the transgressive fourth question. It's going to have Newman's name put onto a list. It says, though Buddhism teaches you shouldn't pray to these deities and rely on yourself in chance of blessings from monks, some include statements that the Devas will pour blessings and protect practitioners of the Dhamma. Are these blessings purely worldly in orientation, or in Theravada are there deities that can help you in your practice at all? And yeah, deities can help you in your practice. But in Buddhism, the whole thing is kind of short-circuited because in Buddhism, it all depends on your own karma. So whether a god helps you or not is still dependent on your own karma. If it's not your karma to be helped by a god, you won't be. And if it is your karma to be helped by a god, then that very much increases the odds that you will be helped by a god. But for example, just to give the first example that comes to mind, the Bahia Sutta, which is Udana 110, one of my favorite suttas in the Pali Canon. There's this non-Buddhist ascetic named Bahia who lives in Western India. And he's getting a lot of respect and veneration from the lay people. And they think he's enlightened. And so he's starting to think, well, maybe I'm enlightened. And then a deity, a small g god who used to be a kinsman of his but has gone to heaven, descends to earth and tells him, no, you're not really a god, or you're not really fully enlightened. But there is a person who is fully enlightened called Gautama Buddha who lives, in the kingdom of Kosala, far to the east. And so Bahia, it inspires Bahia to go and meet the Buddha, who then preaches to him a short kind of Zen-like sermon, which causes Bahia to become enlightened. So that would be a case of a deity helping somebody in their Dhamma practice. And it does happen sometimes. But again, it's not going to happen unless it's your karma. It's all that kind of stuff is short-circuited to a certain extent, like in a philosophical sense, by your own karma, because it's going to happen in accordance with your karma. If it's not your karma to be helped by a deva, you won't be helped by a deva. So I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from the saboteur. Singular, not plural. And the saboteur says, this is kind of a strange question. The saboteur says, I read somewhere that if you delete someone, in addition to negative karma, you also inherit your victim's karma, whether positive or negative or both, I don't know. For example, it is common knowledge that Stalin deleted God knows how many people directly and indirectly, but it's historically accepted that Beria, I don't know how to pronounce that, Beria deleted Stalin. So would Beria shoulder all of Stalin's karma? In which case, is Stalin now free of all karma and doesn't have to reincarnate? Incidentally, Beria himself was deleted. Of course, the underlying motives are always key. Yeah, I don't know who would say this. It certainly is not a Buddhist doctrine. I mean, that would make karma sort of like a venereal disease, or it's like, they say you're having SECKS, not only with the person you're actually in bed with, but with everybody that they have had SECKS with. It's like karma does not work that way. I mean, that would be so weird if you actually got good karma by deleting saints, so that you would just be taking in all of their saintly virtue into yourself. I mean, that would just elicit a kind of shitstorm, wouldn't it? But like in Theravada Buddhism, that one of the ways of guaranteeing just rebirth in hell is to kill an enlightened being, to delete a fully enlightened arahant, I should say. But then again, I mean, they kind of don't have, and they still have latent karma. So I guess you could still inherit the karma of an enlightened being, because they still have latent karma, even though they're not making new karma. But that would just be awful. I mean, if you had like devout Buddhists who think that by deleting saints, they're going to be taking in all this virtuous karma. I mean, yeah, that's just weird. So, yeah, I mean, your karma is just your own mental states. It's not like some kind of substance that you just like absorb from somebody else. That from the Buddhist point of view anyways, karma is primarily volition. So it's your mental states. And it includes a lot of like subconscious mental states. So that if you are deleting or just like attacking a saint, that deep down you're going to pick up on that and realize that you're like being mean to someone who just really does not deserve it at all, which is going to make it worse. Make your volitions worse, because deep down anyway, that you are inflicting, bodily harm or whatever onto someone who doesn't even deserve it. I mean, I guess their own karma would cause you to be able to do it, but I mean, where do I go from there? Man. So, yeah, I mean, you don't just inherit somebody else's karma if you like cause them to cease to metabolize on this planet. They still have, I mean, after they die, they still have their own karma. Stalin, regardless of how he died, I mean, he still has his karma. It's not like he's just going to become fully enlightened or like float up into a heaven realm just because somebody that was approximately as bad as he was offed him. Yeah, so I don't know where the saboteur read this, but it's heresy, pernicious wrong view at best. And at worst, it could just actually be, if people actually believed it, they'd be going around trying to delete saints just to get their karma. Sort of like some people that would, if they were HIV positive, that they would go and, or also like in Victorian England, if you had syphilis, there were some people that believed that if you fornicated with a virgin, that you would get rid of the syphilis. And really, they were just spreading it and keeping it to themselves and also spreading it to some hapless virgin or recent ex-virgin. Oh, yeah, I mean, it's not even. And I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from PSA. PSA says, which meditation technique or techniques are you practicing nowadays? And like I've said several times before, I'm really not doing any formal sitting practice anymore. Partly because there's no way that I would ever do justice to what I was doing when I was a professional meditator as a monk. And so the only real meditation techniques I do are occasional spontaneous oming, just doing om as a mantra quietly to myself when doing other things, or just mindfulness of daily activities, being aware of weird mental states or not so weird mental states, or just sometimes it's just like, it'll just kind of hit you that all of a sudden you're aware of the clothes touching your skin and your own breathing or whatever it is that you're sensing. You just kind of detach from it and observe it objectively instead of just having that be you. So yeah, the only meditation techniques I really do now are occasional spontaneous oming and just sati sampajanya of just mindfulness of just whatever's going on, which also tends to be spontaneous. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, if one is asked about Dhamma by someone who might have heard of the Buddha but knows nothing about Dhamma, what are the boundaries to sharing the sparse experience or knowledge one may have? Is it preferable to remain silent? Well, it depends on how much you know about it. I mean, if you're uncertain about much of any of Buddhist doctrine, you might just tell them you really don't know enough to be able to teach them anything and sort of refer them to a more knowledgeable source. But I mean, if you know the fundamentals, I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt to just give a brief explanation of like the Four Noble Truths. If something like no self is something that you're having difficulty grasping, then you shouldn't try to teach it to somebody else, especially if they're inclined to be, I mean, whether they're skeptical or even just like gullible and just believing anything you say. I mean, either way, it's not really helping them. For them to reject like some profound teaching just with contempt, or for them to just like accept maybe an inaccurate explanation as gospel truth. I mean, either way, it's not really helping them much. But I mean, to the extent that you understand something fairly well, like the Four Noble Truths is fairly basic, the Noble Eightfold Path, just simple basics like that, there's no harm at all in sharing that with somebody else if they're receptive to it. I mean, if they're just openly disrespectful to it, then you're better off just not talking about it. In fact, there are rules of monastic discipline forbidding a monk to teach Dhamma. No matter, I mean, he could be a scholar, he could be an authority on the subject, but it's still against the rules for a monk to teach Dhamma to someone who is openly disrespectful. And it could just be like a cultural thing, like the monk is barefoot and the person is wearing shoes or has their head covered or is holding a weapon. And it could just be like they're a soldier or something, but still, it's just they should have sufficient respect to show respect for the Dhamma, not necessarily even for the monk, but just show respect for Dhamma. And if they're openly disrespectful or just carelessly disrespectful, then you're better off not teaching it to them. It's kind of interesting, some of the rules, like a monk is not allowed to teach Dhamma to someone who is walking on the path if the monk is walking beside the path. It's like a narrow path. And so, I mean, you'd have to go single file for people to be walking on that path together. And if the monk is behind, he's not allowed to teach Dhamma. And if he's to the side of the path, he's not allowed to teach Dhamma. But if he's in front, then he can teach Dhamma, especially if the person that he's teaching Dhamma to doesn't have shoes on, or a hat, or carrying a weapon, etc., etc. So, I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Trzaskaziz. And Trzaskaziz says, what size are these new Atthakavagga books? Normal or pocket size? And I just so happen to have one right here. So this is like the most compact version of my Atthakavagga translation in existence thus far. And somebody generously just volunteered to have over 100 copies of this printed up for free distribution. And I haven't really read through it, so I don't know what kind of typos there might be. There could be typos, but also the only kind of drawback to this, aside from any possible typos, which may or may not be in there, is that they're not really lined up. The original idea was to have Pali on one side and English on the other side, and that if you knew enough Pali, you could compare the Pali version with the English version, just so you could be confident that I wasn't just making shit up, because some of the stuff in the Atthakavagga really is just, it's not Orthodox Theravada. So an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist who knows Pali could refer to the original just to see for himself or herself that it really was a good translation. But just the way it's formatted, it's they don't really line up. Like you've got the beginning of the Chula Viyuha Sutta in Pali on this side, whereas you're already like halfway through the Chula Viyuha Sutta on the English side. And then towards the end, let's see. I mean, it all just, after the Pali runs out, it just goes to straight English on both sides. So, I mean, that's kind of a quibble. I really have nothing but respect and gratitude to the person who went to the trouble of doing this. There wasn't really much consultation going on. I mean, I didn't really have a chance to look at the proofs or anything. And it may be that, I mean, it's just, sometimes they're just like glitches where, I mean, you just don't know how to fix it or something. So it is the way it is. And it's, I mean, the English, which is what most people are just going to read anyway, is still fine. So thank you to the person who went to the trouble. This comes closer to my original idea of something really small that you could put in your pocket and carry around with you, instead of some big book that, I mean, you have to carry it under your arm or something, or in a big bag or something. So yeah, there are these. And if anyone wants one, I'm not really in a position to pay for the postage for everybody's book, but self-addressed stamped envelope, I guess, maybe those prepaid postal service first class envelopes would work. So I could find out how much those cost, and that might be the price of postage, or someone could just send me one, and then I could send a copy of this, which is very nice little size, I have to admit. So let's just move on to Trzaska's next question. Did you plug your computer this time? Yeah, I had, because I moved into this room that, yeah, I brought the cord and it was pretty obvious to plug it in. So yeah, it's plugged in. Now on to Trzaska's third question. Do you know this as a fact that Jain monks would just go to some forest and self-delete in a way probably most of us would not do, not eating and drinking anything? I'm pretty sure, if I remember, that the the idea that if a monk or an ajivaka thinks that they have just reached full enlightenment, that the thing for them to do is just, especially the Jains, just forget the Ajivakas. The question is about the Jains anyway. So I'm pretty sure that I have read in a Jain text that when a Jain thinks that he has exhausted all of his karma, that he should just go off into like an isolated, remote area, just some wasteland, and just squat down and remain motionless until he is no longer alive. Because if you think you've exhausted all of your karma as a Jain, there's a chance that you might accidentally create more karma right before you die. So, I mean, you want to just end it as soon as you can. You can't really commit violence upon yourself because that would be creating karma right at the last minute. So you just squat down and remain motionless until you're not alive anymore. And I seem to remember that I have read that in a Jain scripture. But just because it says something in a religion scripture doesn't mean that most followers are going to be following that. So you can just read the Bible. Gather not up your treasures upon the earth. How many Christians follow that one? I mean, even a lot of ordained Christians don't follow that one. So, yeah, and I would guess that most Jain monks don't think that they've become enlightened anyway. It would be like a very tiny minority of Jain monks, probably most of those being not entirely right in the head, who are just like misjudging their own spiritual state, like overestimating their attainment or whatever, who would try that. But it's also, I mean, you can read about it in other books, but I do seem to recall that I have read that in a Jain text, in an English translation of a Jain text. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, etc. And Stellar Supreme does have like an obscure way of communicating sometimes. And I'm not 100% sure that I understand this question. He says, you have remarked that leftist compassion is dangerous, but I recall reading some Pali Canon passage stating that a noble king or sovereign has a sort of automatic rulership. He has command over state coercion, but the Buddha says the noble among them would secure prosperity such that the folk that live in his territory wouldn't even need to worry about bandits. They would leave their doors unlocked. Could we assume that this might be a mark of the best in a superior age, whereas we now live in more of a dark age where being a sovereign is just bad karma? Well, I understand the gist of this question. So just because there are a few obscure passages or phrases contained within this question, I think I can still answer it. See, this is just kind of unpack it a little bit, though. He says that I have remarked that leftist compassion is dangerous. Yeah, leftist compassion can be suicidal. Like if you refuse to punish or at least imprison violent criminals, which is a common leftist practice nowadays. You just go and sin no more, and then they just keep on sinning. Yeah, I mean, that is suicidal to a society. I guess I said the word that you're not supposed to say on YouTube, so I guess the algorithm just got dinged. So anyways, let's see. He recalls reading some Pali Canon passage stating that a noble king or sovereign has a sort of automatic rulership. I'm not exactly sure what an automatic rulership would mean. I don't think that would mean autocracy. So he has command over state coercion, but the Buddha says the noble among them would secure prosperity such that the folk that live in his territory wouldn't even need to worry about bandits. Yeah, well, part of that, they wouldn't have to worry about bandits because the bandits have all been arrested or executed or punished. And I mean, that's just the way it was in the Buddha's time. I mean, there were no saintly kings in the Buddha's time that I'm aware of. Maybe Ashoka a few hundred years later might qualify, at least after he saw the light. But I mean, even in the Buddha's time, there were this grisly public executions, for example. And there is a certain Jataka story called the Tamiya Jataka. I've mentioned this before, where, I mean, this is ancient India, where the Buddha, in a previous existence, before he was the Buddha, he was still just the Bodhisattva, is born as a royal prince. And when he is like a toddler, he's sitting on the king's lap on his throne while the king is making like royal judgments, which included having criminals put to death. just gruesome public executions, this sort of thing. And the Bodhisattva, Prince Tamia, realized, and when he grows up, he's going to become the king. He was next in line in the succession, and then he was going to have to do that because it's the duty of a king to punish criminals, to punish them in such a way that it discourages others from taking up a life of crime. And so he just pretended to be a deaf mute after that to avoid being like the next king, because to be a king, you have to do bad things. It's just what is right from an ethical point of view is not necessarily right from a political point of view. So, could we assume that this might be a mark of the best in a superior age, whereas we now live in more of a dark age where being a sovereign is just bad karma? I mean, the karma of sovereigns in the Buddhist time was much worse. I mean, you had royal princes executing their own fathers in order to get the succession. Like in ancient Persia, it was the king, the Shah, he would have a harem of wives. He'd have multiple wives. He'd have multiple sons. But after he would pass away, you'd have like this mass die-off of royal princes where you got the one who's going to be the next king is just eliminating all the competition. To some degree, that happened in the Roman Empire also, but it certainly was happening in ancient India, like during the Buddha's own lifetime. King Ajatasattu killed his own father so that he could become king. And this is mentioned like in the Samanyapala Sutta, which I think is the second sutta of the Digha Nikaya, where King Ajatasattu comes and listens to the Buddha, teaching Dhamma, and then King Ajatasattu just kind of thanks him and walks away. And then the Buddha makes a remark to the extent that, he probably would have had more of a positive response. He would have been more helpful to him if his mind wasn't, or like his spirit wasn't already like damned. He was like a damned soul from a Buddhist point of view because he had murdered his own father so that he could become king. So, yeah, in the Buddhist time, you really did have just these really horrible, grisly public executions that were just standard. And that was, I mean, there were people being publicly hanged in London just as late as the 19th century. I don't know when they stopped doing that, public executions, even in the city of London. But it's relatively recent that people have become more feminized, which has its good points and its bad points. The self-destructive compassion being one of the bad points, or self-destructive compassion is a pretty good bad point to mention. But the good point of being feminized as a society is there's just less like public violence that would just be considered unthinkable now, whereas not too long ago, well up into modern times, it was just commonplace. So let's see here. It all balances out in the long run. But seriously, what is right and good from an ethical point of view is not necessarily what is right and good from a political point of view. And ideologues who insist that politics be purely ethical and good are completely unrealistic. And if their policies are put into practice, their ideals are converted into official policies, that civilization is doomed. Like what's going on in the European Union right now. Western civilization is in free fall in most of Western Europe anyway. But you can have centuries of decline before you finally hit the collapse point. That's like what happened with the Roman Empire. It was declining for hundreds of years before the collapse finally happened. So let's just move on to the next question here. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid asked kind of an interesting question that I haven't been asked before. He says, I've read that in the pre-modern age, children were seen almost as little adults, and that the concept of childhood being a time for innocence and play is actually a relatively modern idea. How are children seen in practically pre-modern country like Burma? Well, before I answer that question, I just want to point out something with regard to this first statement. He says that in the pre-modern age, children were seen almost as little adults, and the concept of childhood being a time for innocence and play is actually a relatively modern idea. Yeah, I don't think so. I really think that that is not an accurate statement. For example, in Rome, 2,000 years ago and more, it was a custom, and I should have studied up on this. I mean, I've learned about it in the past, but before a child wore the, what is it, the toga virilis, it's like the toga of an adult, that they would wear white, I think, and they would have this amulet, which for some reason would often have like an erect phallus as part of the symbolism on this amulet. So I mean that's kind of sexualized, but still, what so long as you were in the presence, like a Roman adult, especially the patrician class, if they were in the presence of one of these white robed children who hadn't reached the adulthood yet, it was like totally uncool to use like vulgar language, to cuss in front of them, to do anything openly sexual in front of them. I mean, that was just taboo because children in ancient Rome, at least, early ancient Rome, like Republican days, were seen as practically sacred in their innocence. So, yeah, Xenothoid read that in the pre-modern age, children were seen almost as little adults. The concept of childhood being a time for innocence, relatively modern idea. That's not universally true. Maybe some cultures, certainly some civilizations may have been that way. But in our European culture, like at least with regard to Rome, it wasn't that way at all. I would guess that other societies, other civilizations were similar in the idea that children really are innocent. They're supposed to be innocent, and it's just like taboo to cuss in front of children, for example. So, getting to the actual question though, how are children seen in a practically pre-modern country like Burma? It's kind of strange that I never really, I mean, I wasn't really like collecting anthropological data on how children are treated in Burma. Like, I mean, devout Buddhist Burmese people, like villagers, generally don't cuss much anyway. I mean, there's cussing is relatively rare in Burma anyhow, just because it's a more religious culture than the secular West. Um, so I mean, I never really noticed anything unusual about how the Burmese treat their children. They're much less likely to. I don't know. It's like some parents will spank their kids, but I mean, it does seem to me that Burmese village children are allowed to run amok more than Western children. At least when I was a kid, it may be really different now. It may be that any kind of discipline for your children, or just like with violent criminals, is just like a no-no now. But yeah, I mean, I really didn't understand. I didn't really notice much different about how Burmese parents raise their kids than the way Western parents raise their kids, other than Burmese kids were more likely to just be just running amok, just running and screaming with the parents, just kind of not caring. Like little kids just running, just tearing through a monastery, just screaming at the top of their lungs. A lot of the parents just don't see anything unusual or inappropriate with that. That used to bother me a little bit. But it wasn't like they were treated like adults so much. Not that I noticed. I mean, they'd be talked to like little kids. The parents would be trying to teach them to, offer food to the monks and teach them how to do chanting and that kind of thing. But I really didn't notice any significant difference. And it could just be human nature just the parental instincts is just part of a kind of animal instinct in humans, so that all over the world, parents probably like deal with their own children in roughly similar ways that are all just human nature. And I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question. I mean, it may have been that way, but I just didn't notice it. So the second question from Xenothoid is the inner child a concept in Buddhist texts and Buddhist culture? Not that I know of. Yeah, the inner child. I mean, I've never really studied up on much of the inner child other than I do remember it was a concept in this one of the early self-help books that came out. This was like a mass market self-help book, Games People Play, which came out in like the 50s or 60s. It was really like a forerunner of the just the mass quantity of self-help books that came out in like the 70s and 80s. But yeah, there was like three different kind of personalities that each person has. You know, you start off with the child, and then you become the lover, and then you become the parent. If I remember correctly, I think it was those three stages. And it's like everybody has all three stages. You know, even after you outgrow being a child physically, still you have like the inner child, I guess. And sometimes, you know, like you're being playful or whatever, you're just goofing around, the inner child may come out, and then at other times the parent may come out, you know, the lover may come out, just depending on circumstances and who you're with, setting and all that. But it's not really a concept in Buddhist texts and Buddhist culture, and it's really not much of a concept in the West either. I mean, it's most people really wouldn't know much about it. You know, it's not just something you're taught in school or anything that I'm aware of. But yeah, I don't think it's found anywhere in the Pali texts, the inner child, other than just still got child karma. You know, like karma relating to childhood, either that is going to have to wait until you're a child again for it to reach fruition, or just stuff that you created as a child that can reach fruition at other times. But it's still, I mean, there's just kind of a latent assumption that you have certain childlike, at least childlike karma contained within your being, your psychic momentum. But I mean, it's not really singled out as a kind of concept that is discussed exclusively, anything like that. And so I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question, which is, do you feel that you are still connected with your inner child? And I guess I'm kind of four-dimensional, sort of like Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-Five. And you read a lot of Vonnegut, where, I mean, it's kind of timeless. I mean, I don't feel the need to conform to acting my age, so to speak. Like when I was a kid, I could be like precociously mature for my age. And sometimes now that I have white hair, I can still be sort of the opposite of precocious and behave in a childlike manner or whatever, just because I'm unstuck in time, so to speak. But I mean, the inner child, am I still connected with it? That's kind of a tough question, because I mean, the whole concept of the inner child is really not part of my. I mean, I don't really single it out as some kind of category. You know, it's just sort of blended in. I would call it more of a blending. You know, childlike qualities, childlike karma is just all blended into the mix, and I don't have like this inner child compartment in my psyche that I'm aware of. But it's there, definitely. Maybe more so than in most people my age. That I'm like less. I feel have less of a like a subconscious obligation or need to act my age or something. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. An Ethiopian Fake Tig says, after I clear my throat again, I have somewhat of a phlegmatic temperament. Going with Galen, I've always considered myself to be largely phlegmatic. I think I got more sanguine as I got older, but especially when I was young, I was very phlegmatic, and I have more phlegm than the average person, I think. So, having gotten that out of the way, Ethiopian Fake Tig says, during the time of the Buddha, has he met any other beings that were enlightened without learning his teachings, or does the Buddha have a patent on enlightenment? According to Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, then yeah, the Buddha didn't meet any other enlightened beings other than his own enlightened disciples. So, yeah. But I'm skeptical of this Theravada Buddhist claim of a monopoly on enlightenment. So the Buddha does, in some of his texts, refer to, all the enlightened beings of the past and all the enlightened beings today and all the enlightened beings of the future, et cetera, et cetera. There does seem to be a kind of implication that there were other enlightened beings that weren't necessarily his own disciples. So it depends on the correct answer to this question depends on how you look at it, I suppose. I mean, if you just want the official Orthodox Theravada Buddhist answer, then the Buddha was, he reinvented enlightenment. And the only other enlightened beings in the world at that time would be his own disciples or people who learned from him and became enlightened as a result of that. That nobody would become enlightened completely independently of the Buddha during the Buddha's time anywhere in the world. That is like the official position of Theravada Buddhism. But again, I am skeptical of that. I do think it's possible for a non-Buddhist to become enlightened, assuming that enlightenment makes any sense in a samsaric context. And so I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question, which is as follows. During your stay in Burma, did you make lifelong friends there, or perhaps people you miss now since you're back in the States? The only person I met in Burma that's still a friend, that we still communicate, there's just one, and that he was a Western monk who lived in Burma at the same time as me, and then he went back to America before I did to take care of his aging parents, and eventually dropped out of the monkhood. And we still communicate sometimes. We still text each other or communicate on the Discord server occasionally. So there's that. But one thing is that some of my supporters in Burma, a few of them were just sort of like Buddhist chauvinists who just think that if you drop out of the monkhood, you're just a failure, a disgraceful failure. So I had a few supporters like that better off just not associating with them. And like the villagers, I mean, I'd have no way of even contacting them. I was mostly living out in remote forest areas when I was in Burma. So, and then also there's just a kind of weird phenomenon I noticed when I was a monk. When another monk drops out of the monkhood, he pretty much just ghosts everybody. And it's largely just out of a feeling of, I don't know, sort of awkwardness, maybe. And I kind of did the same thing too. I mean, I have had a few monks that I used to know who tried to contact me and I didn't respond. So it's something that I noticed before I became a monk, and then I could relate to it because, it's just this weird phenomenon that happens. So largely just a kind of mild, kind of this awkwardness, I guess, would be the best way of putting it. So, yeah, I only had like one friend in Burma that is still a friend now, that there's like communication going back and forth. Not that I like dislike everybody that I used to know besides this one person, anything like that. It's just that I've always been kind of a loner anyway. And so I just went my own way and just pretty much what I've always done. Like old high school friends, I think I might have one of those left that we're still occasionally communicating. So yeah, I'm really not a social person. I've never had like a really big circle of friends, at least not since I got out of school. So, you just go your own way and just do your own thing, and that's about it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Ethiopian Fake Tig. He says, there is a popular Indian American doctor on YouTube called Dr. K. And in a recent podcast, he said that when you meditate for more than 40 minutes a day, you will have higher risks of psychosis. Thoughts on this? Question mark. I'm not exactly sure if that would be accurate. And if so, it's, I'm kind of skeptical of that, but it could be like this slight increase, like your odds, if you don't meditate at least 40 minutes a day, it'd be like 1 in 10,000. And if you do meditate at least 40 minutes a day, 1 in 10,050 maybe. Or, what is the exact correlation? It could be that people who have a higher risk of psychosis anyway are just the ones who are more likely to do the intensive meditation. That's a possibility too. You have to be kind of liminal, kind of on the fringe a little bit to be more likely to do this kind of practice, at least in the West where it's not mainstream. So there's that too. There's all these kind of variables that would have to be nailed down, I think, in order to really understand the situation. But it is true, like Western Buddhism, I was mentioning this earlier today to somebody else, that it does attract quite a few people that are on the fringe. And so it could be that kind of situation also. That it's not so much one causing the other as the other causing the one. But, anyone who's gone to intensive meditation retreats knows that doing intensive meditation can cause people to crack up. So there's that too. But why? What was Dr. K's motives for even saying that? It could be that he's just sort of secularized Indian and kind of opposed to spirituality, thinks it's all bullshit or whatever. And so he'll cherry pick data to kind of reinforce his own bias. It could be something like that too. But even if it's true, even if meditating for more than 40 minutes a day increases your risk of having some kind of mental breakdown, still, for a lot of people, it's worth the risk. Just being a monk who's living in the tropics, it increases your odds of getting malaria or dysentery or like, what's the other one? Like cholera. Just, it increases your odds that you're not going to live as long. But, if you really are motivated to live a spiritual life, if you see the world through a dharmic lens, for example, then stuff like that is just a risk you're willing to take. It's worth it. So let's see here. Just checking to make sure the computer's charging properly, because it does look sometimes like there's a slight lag. And I have no idea what the audio quality on this video is going to be like, because I upgraded the operating system on this computer, and ever since then, my old audio software that was connected to this microphone, it doesn't work anymore. So I'm gonna have to find some new software for what's the word? Just for adjusting the audio properties of this microphone. So let's see. I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. We didn't have very many questions today, but it's like it's taken me forever to answer each question, so it's going to wind up being just as long as the usual video, I think. The usual Q&A episode for those of you who are just listening to the podcast version. So this next question is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And I have to admit, I always like respell Siddhartha's name because he doesn't spell it the way like the Mahayana Buddhists spell the Buddha's name as a layperson. Or Hermann Hesse spelled the name of his hero in the novel by the same name. Anyhow, Siddhartha Lohachita says, what do you think about Orthodox Christianity? It seems like they have a lot of ascetic practices and monasticism. Well, I really don't know that much about Orthodox Christianity. I never really came across much Orthodox Christianity in my younger days. I mean, I've read a lot of Western history, which is more, it contains more Catholicism than any other kind of Christianity. I mean, I've read the Bible more than once. So I understand Christianity fairly well just from a biblical point of view. With regard to the history of the development of Christianity, like I've read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and other books that discuss, like the early Christianity and its evolution, and the schism between East and West, that kind of thing. But with regard to like specific like tenets of Orthodox Christianity, I really don't know that much about it. The common consensus on certain social media is that Orthodox Christianity is the most based. Catholicism probably has more pagan elements, or at least it has a reputation for having more pagan elements, not elephants, but elements. Protestantism, I mean, I kind of had my mind poisoned against Protestant Christianity in general, simply because one of the first things the Protestants did was to abolish monastic orders. And at the same token, they abolished like more advanced practice, like contemplation. So the only major schools of Christianity that still have monks and nuns and contemplative orders would be the oldest ones, like the Catholics, the Orthodox Christians, and then you've got sort of like the Coptic Church and like the Nestorian Syrian Church, some of those ancient, kind of vestigial Christian churches, aside from the two big ones. So, I mean, I've read a lot of Jehovah's Witness material just because they kept giving it to me at one time. But yeah, Orthodox Christianity. I mean, I've read I've read that one book about Orthodox Christianity. It's a little book, something about a pilgrim, about this Russian peasant with a withered arm who just is reciting the Jesus prayer. Dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner. I think there's a little more to it than that. And I mean, I read that. That's probably the most orthodox text I've ever read, aside from the Bible itself. Read a little bit about a few of the Orthodox mystics. Read Dostoevsky, who is talking about Orthodox Christianity. Sort of a fictional and more sociological context. I mean, they're into icons. But I think they do have a stronger mystical tradition than Western Christianity, the more Western Christianity, like the Catholics. The Catholics do have certain contemplative orders, like the Carmelites, but I think it's more common in the Greek monastic orders that there's like intensive spiritual practice rather than just, whatever it is that most Catholic monks and nuns do. Oh, so yeah, I mean, I'm really not the kind of person who's qualified really to compare and contrast Orthodox Christianity with other schools of Christianity because I really don't know that much about it. I'm not a Christian, so most of what I know about it is through osmosis. And I mean, I couldn't be an Orthodox Christian because can't be a Christian, really. I just cannot believe the story. There's this narrative you have to believe in order to be a Christian, as far as I can tell, and that's that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He's the only begotten Son of God who died for our sins. And I just, it's really not a viable option for me to believe that. I can't just believe something at will. I can't just decide what I consider to be believable or not. It's either believable or it isn't. And the narrative of Christianity, the stuff that seems essential to being a Christian, I just can't believe it. That's one of the two main reasons why I'm not a Christian. The other is that throughout my life, I've observed so many Christians, and very, very few of them are actually trying to follow the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Like, gather not up your treasures upon the earth, for example. Sell all that you have, give the money to the poor, and follow me. Take up your cross and wander around healing the sick and casting out demons and all that. It's just, it's like people say, well, that just applied to ancient times. That just applied to his chief apostles. And we can just live like heathens and go to church on Sunday and, have at least some lip service to some of the basic teachings. I mean, so many Christians, they'll get divorced and remarried, even though it says right in the Bible, Jesus himself says you can't do that. I guess for people who want to get divorced and remarried, Buddhism is a better option because from the Buddhist point of view, marriage is just a secular affair. It's not even a religious thing. So, yeah, I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Siddhartha Lohachita. He says, do you think the structural problem of Islam is the massive intermingling between cousins and the black people, former slaves? The Muslims of the Middle Ages in what is now Spain, North Africa, Iraq, Iran, or Egypt are not the same as modern Muslims who intermarried with their first cousins. And that had an impact. The same thing happened in India with the reproductive success of the Dalits, or the untouchables, I guess. It's kind of weird. I read just a few days ago in a book by Edward Dutton that in certain Muslim countries, like in North Africa and South Asia, the cousin marriages is between 25 and 50% of the population marry cousins. And he considers that to cause lower IQ on average due to inbreeding. But the structural problem of Islam, it seems to me the main problem of Islam is the founder of Islam was a warlord who was a bandit who, like, forced himself sexually upon female prisoners of war, in some cases with their recently deceased husband just lying on the ground a few yards away. That he had hundreds of people beheaded, hundreds of men beheaded, and their wives and children sold into slavery. The man was a product of the Dark Ages. He was a barbarian warlord, a violent barbarian warlord. And so you get into modern times and you've got people who are still sort of emulating a violent barbarian warlord as the ideal man. I would consider that to be much more of a structural problem of Islam than inbreeding. But I suppose it's true that the Muslims of the Middle Ages in what is now Spain, North Africa, Iraq, Iran, or Egypt are not the same as modern Muslims. Well, it's largely because they were just sort of new converts at first. And it was just this new system that was like in the full flush of enthusiasm that, they thought they were going to conquer the whole world, which fortunately didn't happen. Although they did exterminate the Buddhists of India and various other countries. So, I mean, you can say that inbreeding is a structural problem of Islam, but I don't think it's the main structural problem of Islam. I really think that Islam itself is the main structure of is the main problem, in that it's just it's like relatively primitive. I mean, the Jewish religion of like the Old Testament Judaism is similar. I mean, Moses was more of a warlord than he was like an advanced spiritual teacher. Moses also was ordering the deaths of thousands of people and the enslavement of their wives and children and all this. So Muhammad and Moses, assuming that Moses existed, I assume there was probably some kind of proto Moses upon which the the myths coalesced, just like there was probably originally a proto Hercules, a proto Achilles, that kind of thing. So, but the thing with the Jews is that as they became more civilized, their religion became more civilized. There are very few Hebrews now who would strictly adhere to this Old Testament view of like all the Canaanites must be exterminated. I mean, you could argue that the whole thing with Gaza is similar, but then again, according to the Jewish religion, according to the Old Testament, God commanded the Israelites to exterminate all the non-Jews in the Holy Land. So they've restrained themselves fairly well with regard to that, I suppose. Oh man. But yeah, I mean, there have been wise, possibly even enlightened Muslims, like the Sufis, for example, who did absorb some Buddhist and Hindu ideas. I mean, some people become saintly or sagely, possibly even enlightened, as much in spite of their religion as because of it. But I mean, just overall, Islam it's sort of like a relatively foolish, primitive kind of religion that is easily accepted by foolish, primitive kind of people. Well, I suppose I shouldn't be indulging too much in this kind of critique. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame. Cyrus Frame, oh, he's asking a Nagarjuna question, and I don't have the fez handy. Well, okay. Cyrus Frame says, you said regarding Nagarjuna that you are never going to reach the goal by philosophizing. Eventually, you have to let go of it. I think of this as you can't think your way into it or out of it, whatever it is. I thought you made a very interesting point, but do you believe in a goal? Surely a goal is a form of wanting something. Implicit in it is a view that there is something better in the future than this to aim for. Well, certainly, like in Pali, it's atta, can be translated as the goal. Sometimes in Pali, in translations, the word atta is translated as the goal, that Buddhism accepts, or at least Theravada Buddhism accepts, that there is a goal to aim for. But the goal is like this nebulous one. I mean, you don't have like this firm concept of what the goal is. It's just you're trying to transcend your own delusion. And once you've transcended that, then you attain this goal that really you couldn't fathom it or understand it before you reached it. So let's see here. Do I believe in a goal? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a trick question because you call it an it, but the goal itself is kind of, it's like off the scale. You know, it's like the goal is to transcend samsara, but anything that you do or say or think is necessarily samsaric. So, I mean, it's trying to cure yourself of your own insanity is the goal. I mean, if you have a goal, eventually you have to like stop having a goal, really. That's very advanced practice, though. I mean, so long as you have something that you're attached to, something that you're clinging to, some kind of aspiration, some kind of desire. I mean, that is going to serve as just this obstacle to your liberation or your enlightenment. But it can be very handy to have a goal like early on, and then you have it's like you eliminate all other attachments. You just have this one big desire left. That's the desire for enlightenment. And then you try and try and try and try to become enlightened, and then you fail. And then finally, it's like there's a kind of just surrender where you just let go of even the desire to become enlightened. You know, it's just sort of almost like giving up. It's just surrender. And this is common in like Christianity. This idea of someone trying to be a saint, you know, they're trying to go to heaven just through their own efforts. And finally they realize they can't do it. And so it's just like they have this come to Jesus moment, so to speak. It's just, I can't do it, God. If I go to heaven, it's going to be through your grace. I just fling myself upon your mercy. And it's like this surrender is, it allows them to reach the next stage, to transcend this wallowing in samsara that they were stuck in previous to that. So is a similar kind of thing in Buddhism also, where it's like you reduce your desires and attachments down to this one. So you've already made a lot of progress by getting rid of your desires for like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, ice cream, and all that. So you just have this one big attachment, and it helps you to refine yourself, to purify your mind, you know, do good, refrain from doing evil, purify the mind. But still there's this one obstacle left, which is the desire for enlightenment itself. And so finally you just let go of that. Possibly through some crisis, through some dark night of the soul, you just let go of even the desire for enlightenment and just surrender to what is. And that's it. But I mean, it helps, I suppose, especially at the beginning and intermediate levels, to have a goal. But ultimately, even the goal has to be let go of. So I'm just going to move on to Cyrus Frame's next question. He says, also, how important do you think logic and philosophy is? I tend to think logic is very important. This is one reason I like the Atthakavagga so much, is I think it is very logically sound, what with its absence of reifications and of metaphysical assertions. It seems to me that Tibetan Buddhist philosophy is almost the opposite of that, but the Dalai Lama, you know, he has the Lama spelled with 2 L's, but the Dalai Lama seems like a very peaceful, maybe enlightened man. However, I have met similarly peaceful people who know nothing about Buddhism at all, so who knows? I suppose an aspect of this is that we have to concentrate on our own minds, as we cannot truly determine those of other people. So, you know, most of this is like commentary. So the actual question is right here up at the top. How important do you think logic and philosophy is? Okay, I think the main benefit of logic, and also largely of philosophy, but of logic in particular, is it's a bullshit detector. It helps you to weed out sloppy reasoning. So, I mean, you can get rid of like really delusional ideas. You can probably get rid of most of them, not all of them, but most of them, through like rational thought. Just really soft-headed, foolish ideas get weeded out through logic and philosophy. And philosophy also, I mean, it has that goal. You know, it's one of the main points of philosophy. I think it was Max Muller said this a long time ago, more than 100 years ago, is that one of the basic principles of philosophy is like doubting what most people would just accept at face value. You know, you're starting to doubt just basic principles. You know, like maybe this isn't reality. You know, it's like most humans, as well as like pretty much all dogs, pigs, and chickens, just assume that this phenomenal world we're living in is reality. And so long as you think that it's reality, you're much less likely to try to do anything about being stuck in it. So philosophy, one of the benefits of philosophy is the very idea that there is something better and higher than what we're in right now. I mean, religion kind of does that too, in a different way. But logic in particular is mainly a bullshit detector. But you can take logic and philosophy to the extent of like Nagarjuna, where you just criticize to death every possible point of view until just emptiness is all that's left. And then you see through the emptiness into ultimate reality, ideally. So philosophy, like a practical philosophy, has the benefit of teaching you why to practice Dharma or Dhamma and how to practice Dhamma. It gives you enlightenment as even a possibility. You're much less likely to strive for enlightenment if you don't even have a concept of it. Even though the concept is going to be ultimately samsaric and delusional, at least it's moving you in the right direction. It's leading you to the jumping off point. So I guess you could say the main purpose of philosophy from a dharmic point of view is to lead you to the jumping off point. And logic is mainly just a bullshit detector. It helps it weed out just crappy belief systems, or just soft-headed, gullible, foolish belief systems. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the very last question. And this is from Fred. Fred says, can most mundane methods like the precepts penetrate the depths of the subconscious? For example, like an iceberg with only the consciousness poking through? Well, let's see. Most mundane methods like the precepts, certainly they penetrate the depths of the subconscious to some degree, mainly because karma is itself mostly subconscious. So when you're following precepts or just living an ethical life in accordance with whatever ethics you're following, I mean, that is influencing your karma, and your karma is mostly subconscious. So definitely, I mean, anything you do is influencing the subconscious mind. So even stuff you're doing at the surface level, still is having an influence on the subconscious mind. So it is, as Fred says here, penetrating the depths of the subconscious. So yeah, I mean, that's fairly straightforward, I think. I mean, especially if you consider that karma is largely subconscious, mostly subconscious. And you're carrying that around all the time without fully realizing it most of the time. And I mean, your karma literally is action. I mean, that's what karma literally means, is action or acting, deed, that kind of thing. But it's more just the psychic momentum. I mean, from a Buddhist philosophical point of view, it's like the momentum of your mental states. And it's largely subconscious because, I mean, your thinking ego isn't fully aware of it. So I guess I answered that question. So I guess I answered all the questions. And so I guess we are done. And like I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, especially with regard to Dharma. I mean, not necessarily. You can ask other questions too. But mainly the purpose of these Q&As or Q's and A's are with regard to Buddhism, I suppose, especially Theravada Buddhism, and also early Buddhism, like pre-Theravada Buddhism, which was one of my specialties, one of the things I was most interested in, because as a monk in particular, especially, I was really trying to get to what the Buddha really taught, just cut through as much of the mythology and propaganda and all that kind of stuff, and just try to get to what the Buddha actually taught. So questions about that, questions about Burma, like one or two questions this time. Questions about me personally, I don't get too personal. No questions about my junk, that kind of stuff. And no more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. and like and subscribe. Just utterly obliterate the like button. Don't just smash it. Just destroy it. And check out the URL links below. And again, I'm still waiting for the illustrations for my 4th book, which will come out, I hope, shortly after I get the illustrations, because I need the cover art in order to design like the text on the cover and that sort of thing. And aside from that, all I got to say to you is be happy.